There are some places in the ocean where sharks shouldn't exist. Water's so cold they could freeze a tropical predator's blood or stop its metabolism entirely. Huge patches of ocean starved of oxygen that the simple process of breathing borders on impossible. Invisible geographic boundaries in the sea so deep or isolated they form evolutionary prison walls. And temperature divides that split entire continents of marine life into separate worlds. And yet, every so often, sharks cross these boundaries and end up in some of the most hostile places on our planet where technically they shouldn't be able to survive. Today's video then is about those maps, the invisible maps, ones that aren't drawn by terrestrial coastlines but by biology, chemistry, and evolution. It's about the species that obey those maps and occasionally the individuals that don't. I'm Kristian Parton, a marine biologist and shark researcher. Welcome back to another episode of Shark Bytes, everyone. Okay, today's gonna be fun. I love talking about trailblazer sharks that don't follow the rules. So let's first begin then with one of, if not the most fundamental constraint on life in the oceans: oxygen. Sometimes it can be easy to think of the oceans as these massive universal spaces where conditions are mostly the same thing across big areas, but that couldn't be further from the truth. This place is one of the most dynamic and constantly changing spaces in the world, and the species that live here have to adapt to those changes. In large swathes of the global ocean, there are layers where dissolved oxygen drops dramatically. Dissolved oxygen, put simply, is the oxygen gas that is mixed in with water molecules, and sufficient levels of it are of course incredibly important for underwater animals that need to breathe. Scientists refer to the large areas of the ocean where dissolved oxygen is low as oxygen minimum zones, or OMZs. Some of you watching at home might have heard me mention these OMZs before on the channel, but they're not entirely like these surface dead zones that you might occasionally see in environmental documentaries or on the news. Out in the open ocean, they can be in mid-water layers, sometimes spanning hundreds of meters down and stretching across massive sections of ocean basins. And so for animals like sharks, who are these high-performance predators with demanding metabolic needs, OMZs should represent a biological barrier to them. Fish need oxygen, sharks especially need oxygen, and scientific research done previously backs up this low oxygen barrier. Satellite tracking studies show that blue sharks, a pelagic open ocean species, change their behavior pretty dramatically around OMZs. Most notably, their maximum dive depths shrink when oxygen levels fall, effectively compressing their actual usable habitat towards the surface and towards fisheries. For those of you that learned about this last time on a previous Shark Bytes episode, can you remember what that's called? Anyway, if we look then at catch data analyses, we can see that also tells a similar story. Blue shark catch rates in pelagic longline fisheries tend to be at their highest along strong oxygen gradients, particularly where dissolved oxygen drops down to around 1.6 to 3.4 milliliters per liter, indicating that at the very least, these sharks cluster around the edges of hypoxic water. So for a while we thought that these sharks don't really tend to enter these low oxygen zones, but they orbit above and around them. And so from a physiological perspective, it's pretty clear that low oxygen levels draw boundaries most of the time, but this is the peculiar bit. Some of these pelagic species, including blue sharks, shortfin makos, and even juvenile whale sharks, occasionally dive into or transit through these hypoxic layers. They'll do it briefly and strategically, and they're probably not down there for long, but not all sharks are completely excluded from these areas, which tells us these oxygen minimum zones are regions where energetically it's difficult to survive, but not impossible. And I'd say nowhere is more dramatic and difficult to survive than a different end of the spectrum: the cold. For decades and decades, every book you'll have read on sharks likely suggested something strange. The Southern Ocean, especially the waters directly adjacent to the Antarctic Peninsula, represents one of the few regions on Earth completely devoid of sharks. This region is well known for its extreme cold, inhospitable conditions, and utter isolation from the rest of the world. And for years we've been led to believe that there are no sharks here. It's simply too cold for them to survive, which in itself is a bit of an odd assumption because there are a few shark species we know of that can survive Arctic waters in the northern hemisphere. Greenland sharks would be a good example. But recently, that assumption has been completely flipped on its head. Researchers from the Minderoo UAW Deep Sea Research Center dropped a camera down to around 500 meters just off the southwestern coast of the South Shetland Islands, which, as you can see on this map, is literally a stone's throw from the Antarctic Peninsula itself. And in doing so, they managed to inadvertently film the first in-situ footage of a shark in Antarctic waters, and very possibly the first confirmed direct observation of any shark in the Southern Ocean environment. Specifically, this is a sleeper shark, very likely a southern sleeper shark, Somniosus antarcticus, relative of its northern cousin, the Greenland shark. And it's incredibly rare to witness this shark on a brother at all, let alone this close to the South Pole. Sleeper sharks can tolerate near freezing conditions, immense depths, and low energy availabilities, but finding one here really challenges our ideas of the global distribution limits for all sharks, not just this species. So the cold boundary on our map isn't necessarily a wall that blocks sharks from entering. It's a steep hill, sure, but it's one that's climbable for at least some shark species. And that brings us on to a different type of boundary entirely, a really weird one that's drawn by deep evolutionary geography. Take the Greenland shark that we just mentioned. This species lives pretty much solely in the North Atlantic, but this ocean is directly connected from north all the way to the south down here in the Southern Ocean. And the conditions here in the Southern Ocean are perfect for the Greenland shark. It's the right temperature, there's productive food sources, but it's not found down here. And that's because it's constrained by another invisible barrier that we can't see. If we zoom out from environmental variables for a second and look at species distributions across evolutionary timescales, we can see patterns, entire shark lineages that are confined to specific oceanic regions, because ecological and geological barriers prevent them from successfully colonizing new areas. And these barriers are known by scientists as biogeographic realms. For a long time, scientists debated whether these realms existed at all and questioned the precise boundaries that were put in place, especially for marine biogeographic realms, which are notoriously harder to see. But after some pioneering work by Wallace in the mid-19th century and later Wegener in the early 20th century, scientists realized that biogeographic realms aren't static, they're dynamic, having regularly changed throughout Earth's history. In modern day research, it's thought there are 30 distinct marine biogeographic realms, which you can see on this map here, of which, on average, 42% of species found in those realms are unique or endemic to just those realms. They aren't found anywhere else in the world. One of the most famous of these biogeographic boundaries is called the Wallace Line, which separates two major biological realms, the Oriental realm to the west and the Australasian realm to the east. The Wallace Line acts as a boundary, separating Asian fauna like monkeys, tigers, and elephants from Australian New Guinea fauna like marsupials or monotremes. Native birds here don't even cross this line, which separates the two regions by a distance of just 22 miles. And the same can be said for some shark species in the ocean too. Take Indo-Pacific reef species like epaulet sharks, a small coastal species that enjoys swimming and sometimes walking across shallow inshore reefs. Epaulets don't cross the Wallace Line because for them it acts as a deep water trench barrier that they just can't get across. The same could also be said for Australian blacktip sharks, who are endemic to northern coastal Australia, but largely for some reason they don't venture further north into those Indonesian waters, which would technically be perfect habitat for them. If we quickly flip over into the Pacific Ocean as well, we see the same phenomenon with Pacific angel sharks, again a coastal inshore species that lives on the bottom. These sharks are found both in the North Pacific along the western coast of America and the South Pacific along the coast of Chile. But the two populations are often considered to be distinct from each other and largely separated by deep open trenches in the region, specifically this one here, the Middle America Trench, running up the coast of Costa Rica, Guatemala, and southern Mexico. Another example I think I could possibly give you here would be the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, although technically it's not a marine realm divider, but it is still a biogeographic barrier. For benthic animals, studies on invertebrates have shown a really high percentage of species, sometimes up to 75% of them, are found only on the eastern or western side of the ridge. If you think about it, it's just like a normal mountain range on land, but underwater. The ridge rises 2 to 3 kilometers above the ocean floor, and that's a big barrier for a lot of species. And this could be why we don't really tend to see great white sharks crossing from the western Atlantic, where they're fairly numerable, to the eastern Atlantic, even though conditions on either side are about the same. Sure, there are outliers here like Lydia and Nagumi who briefly crossed the ridge, but both of whom headed back pretty quickly after they crossed it. From a navigational perspective, if white sharks do use the Earth's magnetic field like a compass, and that signal is a lot stronger towards the sea floor, you can imagine then how if there's an underwater mountain range rising 3 kilometers up, forcing you towards the surface, you might not be able to navigate as well as you could have done, so most sharks don't cross it. For many shark species then, the ocean isn't always a highway. For some coastal and benthic species, it's basically an impassable desert. Depth, distance, and lack of habitat continuity ends up creating big old evolutionary fences that can stay in place, sometimes for millions of years. And these fences can end up resulting in regional shark communities that very, very rarely mix with each other. And sometimes a major player in reinforcing those divisions is temperature. Now, temperature isn't always just a comfort preference for sharks, like we often mention on the channel. It can also act as a physiological filter that shapes entire ecosystems. And Australia, I think, is a great example of this. Its northern waters are tropical and warm, and its southern waters are cool to temperate, and that difference in temperature there structures shark communities. For example, bull sharks and tiger sharks dominate the northern waters, whereas great whites dominate the southern or southeastern waters. And so these thermal tolerances end up defining the metabolic efficiency of these sharks, the type of prey that they consume, and even their reproductive viability. The distribution of these shark species in Australia aren't random. They're the outcome of physiological constraints on the animal itself, which also interact with things like currents and climate that define where that animal lives. When I say currents there, for Western Australia at least, currents actually make these invisible borders dynamic and not static or fixed in place. This western coast is influenced by two currents, the Lewin Current, which is warm and flows southbound, and the West Australian Current, a colder northbound one. And these two currents are highly seasonal and cause shifts in temperature, which at certain times of the year enables the warmer tropical species, like the tigers and the bulls, to move further south towards cities like Perth. Dynamic, not static. So temperature effectively can draw these invisible borders across continents and oceans, and these borders tend to remain relatively constant until something crosses them. Now, this is the part of the video where we meet the species that sometimes ignore the map entirely, or at least bend it slightly. Pelagic sharks, the open ocean wanderers, often operate under a different set of rules. Blue sharks, oceanic whitetips, short-fin makos, and even whale sharks and basking sharks are some of the most widespread and mobile vertebrates on Earth. Their physiology, behavior, and ecological niches they sit in allow them to cross oxygen gradients and thermal boundaries, linking distant ecosystems together. And occasionally, some of them head off on journeys that completely stun shark scientists. One famous recent example involved a tagged great white shark, Alicia, whose tag revealed a staggering 23,000-mile journey from South Africa to Indonesia, the first documented connection between the South Atlantic/African population and the Southeast Asia population. That distance there completely shatters the previous record for longest migration of a white shark, held formerly by Nicole, who swam 12,400 miles from South Africa to Australia and back again in the early 2000s. The story of Alicia the white shark is actually a pretty crazy story in terms of how they found the tag, so if you want me to cover that story, make sure you let me know in the comments. But looking at that journey she made, it wasn't just a simple long-distance jaunt. She ended up crossing multiple marine realms on that trip, defying a bunch of biogeographic expectations. There is also another case as well that we have covered on the channel before that definitely challenges the concept of evolutionary separation. Most genetic research that's been done indicates that great white shark populations around the world split about 200,000 years ago and have remained relatively isolated ever since, except for a single hybrid individual discovered just inside the Bermuda Triangle. Further analysis ended up confirming this rare crossbreeding event between an Indo-Pacific individual and a North Pacific individual, but the fact that it was found all the way over here in the Western Atlantic definitely raised a few eyebrows. Of course, events like this are rare, they're statistical outliers, but they do somewhat suggest that biogeographic barriers aren't always absolute. Every now and again, nature ends up rolling a double six. So what does our invisible map actually represent? Well, I'd say it shows us that there's not exactly technical hard borders or forbidden zones, that's for sure. Instead, I think it shows us the probabilities of finding certain sharks, and those probabilities are shaped by things like oxygen availability, temperature, habitat continuity, and evolutionary history. Most shark species stay within their favorable areas or regions because those things that I've just listed push them there. But the variability in that constantly changing and dynamic ocean sometimes might nudge individuals or even species beyond those limits. And when scientists spot them doing it, it expands our understanding of their biology and the map is recalibrated. Sharks have existed for over 400 million years, surviving extinctions, climate upheaval, shifting continents, so I guess it shouldn't really entirely surprise us that every now and again they can defy our little neat and tidy scientific categories. Sometimes a camera dropped into Antarctic darkness, or a satellite tag drifting across oceans, or a strange genetic anomaly in the Atlantic ends up reminding us that the boundaries that we think define life in the oceans are often just the limits of our own observation. And maybe the map or barriers that show us where sharks shouldn't exist is being readjusted. Who knows, our next unexpected sighting or biogeographically defying shark could crop up anywhere, even perhaps somewhere that we've already crossed off the list. Now, just a minute ago, I mentioned to you about that strange hybrid white shark that was discovered in the Northwest Atlantic, and I tell you, all about it in this video here. Spoiler alert, it doesn't look anything like that nonsense AI image that channels were trying to present it as at the time, but the story itself is weird. So if you want to know why a shark that was supposed to be thousands and thousands of miles away ended up on the wrong side of the map, make sure you give this video a click.